Right. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us for this discussion forum this morning. Just to welcome our panelists and introduce them. So this morning, I'll be one of the panelists. I'm Michelle Hamer, the NECF project lead. And then we also have Chanel Ribeiro, who's the NECF project manager, and she'll be running some of the technical side. We've got Fulufelo Tambani, who's the Science Communication Officer for the NECF. And we've got Audrey Ndaba, who's the Collection Management and Curation Coordinator for the NECF. And then our guest panelist today is Jermaine Magwai from the National Museum, and she'll be doing a presentation. So welcome to our panelists and welcome to all of you. And thank you for joining us. Next slide. So I'll just ask Fulu to just give us some guidelines. Thanks, Fulu.
Thank you, Michelle. Good morning, everyone. Before we get started, if we can just go through the guidelines for this discussion forum. We request that you keep your contributions helpful and considerate of everyone, so the host and other participants. And you can use the chat box to say hello and let us know which institution you're coming from. I see someone has already started. Terry has already started. So thank you, Terry. Terry is from EasyGo. Good morning. Can you please, everyone, let's greet each other and let one another know where we're coming from. And so, yeah, I'm Fulu. I am from the NSCF Hub. Hi, Daniela. I see there's also Henry. There's also Cameron. So, yeah, I trust that everyone will be letting us know now as we start with the meeting. And you can also add your questions in the chat box. We will be keeping an eye on the chat box. So put your questions there throughout the presentations and during the discussion forum, the discussions. And we are going to have about an hour of discussions. So we want you to feel free to contribute, feel free to start a discussion and to engage in other discussions. Don't hold back. Feel free to ask any question, feel free to start a discussion. That's why we have the discussion forum. It's exactly for that. So yeah, thank you. Thanks, Michelle.
Okay, thanks, Fulu. Okay, so just before we get started, we've got something to ask you to do immediately. I'll ask Chanel to just explain how to do this for everybody. Chanel.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Michelle. So firstly, we'll be doing some group work later on after the presentations, and Fulu has emailed you the template that we'll be using for those group discussions. If you haven't received it, please check your junk mail folder. And if it's not there, just put in the chat box that you haven't received it, and we'll email it to you again. So for the group work to work, we please need you to rename yourself on Zoom. So what you do is you go to participants, click on participants, and you search for your name in the list, and you hover over your name, and there'll be a more button. And so when you click on the more button, there'll be an option to rename. So then you click on rename, and you rename yourself as your first name and the collection that will be appropriate to you, so the collection that you are working in, because we would like to group people into their collections groups. So if you can do that now, if you're struggling, just let us know in the chat box, and I can try and help you.
Thanks, Chanel. All right, so for today, what is the purpose of this discussion forum? So we're going to go through, we're going to just review the risk mitigation approach that we talked about in the webinar last Wednesday. So just to refresh our minds and maybe look at some of the different things that we might have left a little bit open. And then we're going to have a presentation on risk mitigation activities. So this is what they're doing at the National Museum, their risk assessment and risk mitigation. And then we're going to do an exercise for risk mitigation. So it's very closely linked. That exercise is linked to the assignment for the people doing the course, but also it's practice for the people who are implementing the manual. So if you're not doing the course, but you are participating in implementing the manual, this is an exercise to help you to do that. So it's obviously not as big as doing it properly, but it just will give you maybe some guidance and to learn, opportunity to learn from others, from other institutions, and also to help others. All right, so that's what we're going to be doing today. Next slide. Okay, so just to refresh our minds, about what we spoke about at the webinar. So, you know, risk assessment and risk mitigation. So the purpose of this is to protect the collections in the long term. And we have to know what risks there are that could damage or destroy those collections. And then once we know what the risks are and which ones are the most serious, we can develop plans to reduce or remove those risks. And then we can also allocate resources, so people and money, and raise additional money if necessary, and we can have action plans that can be implemented. So this whole process is essential to protecting the collections in the long term, which is our main role as collections staff. All right, next slide. So we've covered the risk management process. We've looked at the identification of the risks. So in the previous webinar, we looked at that. So looking at the 10 agents of deterioration and the 6 layers of enclosure and using those as a framework for identifying what the risks are. We looked at how to evaluate or analyze the risks once you've identified them. So not all risks are equal. Some occur less frequently than others. Some may not be an event, but they can take short or long time to impact the specimens. And then you also have to think about the extent of the damage that would be done to an individual specimen and how much of the collection would be impacted. So there's various elements. There's 3 main things to look at: the frequency, the damage to individual specimens or objects, and the extent of damage to the collection. And then we said that you have a score for the magnitude of risk. It would be a score between 3 and 15. And that would categorize them as catastrophic, extreme, high, medium, and low risks. And for anything high or above, we'd need a plan to address them. They're not the kind of risks you can just live with. Okay, next slide. And then once you've identified and analyzed your risks, then you have to have a plan. So this is the risk mitigation. And what we said was that you use the 6 layers of enclosure as a start. So you think about how each layer, how can you intervene to remove or reduce that risk? So that's again another kind of framework or approach. So if we used as our example fire, and we said, what can you do at each of the 6 layers of enclosure to reduce the risk of fire occurring, or if fire did occur, reduce the impact of the fire. And so, I mean, you can work all the way from the packaging that individual objects are held in, or the containers that they're in, to the cabinets, to the storeroom, to the building, to the site, and to the region. So you can look at all of those layers, and we came up with some suggestions there. It's metal cabinets, smoke detectors, fire suppression systems, removing all your paper and wood from corridors, removing overhanging trees that could spread fire to the building, removing any vegetation that's growing on the building. So all of these kinds of things are different interventions at different layers of enclosure. All right, next slide. And then there's also a different way of looking at this. It's the 5 stages of control for risk. So you can avoid that risk. So this is something where you just remove it completely. So you avoid it. Or you block it. So you put a barrier between your collection objects and the source of deterioration. You're not avoiding it happening, but you're putting a barrier. Then there's detect. So this would be detecting the agents of deterioration and impacts and monitoring their impacts. And then obviously if you're picking up, you're detecting some agent of deterioration, some risk that's happening there, then you would respond. So this is when your monitoring indicates that there's a problem. And then your response would involve planning, preparation, and effective actions. And then the last one is if things have failed, then you would look at how you recover. So how do you rescue and recover your collections when none of these other stages have been effective. Okay, next slide. Okay, and in the webinar last week, we did this exercise. Fuller set up this Jamboard for us, and we went in and we posted sticky notes with different options for mitigating for risk. And this you would normally have in one table, but we had separate sheets. So what would you do for avoiding fire? We used fire as our example. And how would you avoid fire for your region, your site, your building, your collection room, your fittings or cabinets, and your packaging or containers? How would you block? How would you detect? And how would you respond? And there was lots of information and suggestions that came in on those Jamboards. Right, next slide. Okay, so this is, if you combine those 4 Jamboards, those 4 individual spreadsheets, and you put it into one table, this is what it would look like. You'd have your 5 stages of control down one column. And then at the top, you'd have your different layers of enclosure, region, site, building, collection room, fittings, cabinets, packaging, and containers. And you would put into this all the different options that are available or that could be used to reduce or remove that risk. And I'll put that picture of the manual there because there's a lot of information in the manual that could help you identify these different options. So they're often the standards. So the standards are what you need to do to reduce or remove impacts of risks. Okay, next slide. So once you've got that table with all your options, what we said is that you select the best options because you often can't do everything and not everything will work, or you'll just not have enough money or not enough staff. And so you have to be selective. You select the best options, and the best options are the ones that will reduce the risk or remove it the most, and that are not too expensive. Obviously, if you've got limitless money, then you're not going to worry that much about the cost, but I don't think that's the reality for any of us. So you look at which options for actions would reduce risk most and are affordable and are feasible, and that don't conflict with other options, that don't pose any risks to the collection. So you've got to look at them and assess your different options that are available. Next slide. So this is, we use this table. So this is what your table would look like. You'd list all the options that you had in the previous table. You'd list them all. You estimate how much would this one reduce the risk by, and what would the cost of implementing be. So we did a quick sort of, we asked people to post which ones they thought, which 3 they thought we should implement. And there were lots of different perceptions about that. But if this was for me, I would definitely prioritize number 6 and 7. So you can see number 7, put your types in a fireproof walk-in safe. Only 42,000 Rand, and it will protect those types very well, will reduce the risk by 80%. And putting a fire door at the entrance to the collection store would reduce the risk by 40%. So it's quite high, but it's only 12,000 Rand. And then you can do all of those orange ones, number 1 to 5. They're small, they're cheap, they're easy to do. They don't individually make a big difference, but if you do all of them, then you would be reducing the risk and the impact of fire a lot. Number 8, 4.5 million Rand. It's a lot of money, and it's not the solution. It's only one of the solutions. So that's how you would look at these. Assess each of your options and pick which ones are the best. Next slide. Okay, then once you've selected which options you're going to implement, then you have to plan to implement them. So if you just say we're going to install a fire door at the entrance to the collection, it won't happen. You need to have a detailed plan. You need to know who's responsible and what are the steps you need to take. And so it has to be broken down into action steps, responsibilities, deadlines, and you have to make sure that you've got the funding for it. So each of those options you select needs to be broken down. And of course, that risk treatment plan should be part of the institutional management or strategic plan. So it becomes part of the work of the institution and not something separate. And then we just said, everybody in the institution should know what's happening. There shouldn't be one person who sits there with all the responsibility on their own, and it's not part of the awareness, the communication, or the planning for the institution. Right, next slide. Okay, so this is an example of a risk treatment plan. So this is for one of those options, number 7, installation of walk-in fireproof safe. And you can see it's broken down into the steps. So you could get input from your colleagues at other institutions on what they've got and what's the best type of safe. And then you could assess the number of specimens that need to be stored and calculate the space required and look at where you're going to put this safe in the building. And you would do that as a collection manager, but you might also have to talk to your building manager, and you could get your technician to help you with counting. Got to draw up the specifications for the safe and the criteria for the supplier. And you've got to then involve SCM if that's the way you operate. You've got to do an initial assessment of the likely cost. So you'd search the internet, phone suppliers, get approval from your finance. Then you do your procurement and got to do a contract for the supplier. Then you've got to meet with the supplier to review the specifications, go over where it's going to be installed. Then they'd install that fire safe. Then you've still got to move the collection. So you can see if you don't do all of this breakdown, it often just sits there as something that needs to be done, but nobody knows how it's actually going to get done. Right, next slide. And then once you've implemented, you monitor and review. So how are they working? Has it been properly implemented? Has it been completed? And is everything working? Right, and then we said all monitoring and checking needs to be documented, which is essential for good decision making going forward. So every time you do a check on something, it should be recorded. Every time you record from your might be your temperature meters, your humidity loggers. You've got to keep records of all of these things. Your pest monitoring, keep records. Don't just look at it and replace the sticky trap. Look at it, count, record, keep everything on file. Right? And I think that that's where I'm going to stop. And I think that we can go to the next slide. So this is basically where we're at for this risk mitigation. And I'm now going to hand over to Jermaine, and she's going to tell us about the actual planning that they've done. I've been talking in broad terms and used some examples, but I think it's very useful to have a detailed actual plan that somebody's done. So Jermaine, I'll hand over to you now.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So this is my first presentation for the cause, and I am happy. So it is a risk mitigation presentation for the Terrestrial Invertebrate Department. Next slide, please. Just to introduce myself, I am Jermaine Mahwai, and I am currently on my internship program as a data capturer for the Terrestrial Invertebrates Department. And I would like to thank the NSCF team for organizing this course and allowing us to be part of it. We are actively learning, and it is an amazing experience for me. And I would like to thank my department, my fellow colleagues, and my HOD for supporting me and giving me relevant information for the assessments given for this course. And I tried to give you a picture of myself there holding the specimens. So I'm currently working on beetles. So yeah, I don't have the actual tray for me to show you now, but as you can see on the picture, I'm holding one. Next slide, please. So this is just a reminder for everyone where we are in terms of this presentation. Next slide, please. So the National Museum has a risk management policy and a risk management framework. So we have all those in place, and the implementation of the policy is the responsibility of the CEO through the audit and risk committee. And the HOD of each department is responsible to send their risk register to the CEO every month after consulting with the staff. So everybody has the opportunity to be able to add if they want to add to the risk register. And the purpose of the risk register for the Terrestrial Invertebrates Department is to ensure that a comprehensive risk assessment process is followed to successfully meet the targets for this department by minimizing the impact of unplanned incidents through identifying and addressing potential risks before significant negative consequences occur. And the risk register enables the appropriate identification of risks and the identification of responses to those risks in order to mitigate risks that fall outside of acceptable levels. And the HOD is responsible for ensuring the effective functioning of the risk management in the department, and that the risks are identified, evaluated, and where possible managed on an ongoing basis. And major risks are given to the CEO, so that is a huge responsibility. Next slide, please. So I am about to take you through a table that will give you the risk categories of the Terrestrial Invertebrates Department and the mitigations. So just to note for this part, I am presenting on the collections for the Terrestrial Invertebrates Department. So this involves the entomology collections. We're having also the mites and the spiders. So it's not only the entomology part, but it's just three of the collections, and it's not for the entire institute. Next slide, please. So I'll be presenting on 2 risk categories, which is the operations and the compliance. I will take you through the headings now so that everyone will be able to follow with me as I go on. So on the table, we have in the risk category, we have in the risk description, source of risk, likelihood, which is the probability that a risk will occur, and we have in the impact, which is the potential effect that the risk might have on the department's objectives. We're also having the rating of the risk, which is the risk magnitude that is calculated from multiplying the likelihood risk rating worth the impact risk rating. And we're also having the risk owners on the table and the mitigation actions. So I will start with the first category, which is the operations. And yes, moving on, we're having loaning and sending of materials. We have problems when we send the specimens using the post office. So some of our specimens, they get lost along the way, and there are usually delays of more than 6 months. And since there's this processing going on of parcels, and usually this increases the chance of damage to the specimens. And also there's a high risk for our type materials, and this is likely to occur, and should it happen, this will have a major impact on our departmental plan. And with the magnitude, we're having a high risk, and the people who are responsible for this event, we're having the staff members, we're also having the HOD. So we encourage the use of courier services for sending our parcels and receiving back. Should we have anyone having our loans, having materials on loans, and they want to return them back, we also encourage them to use the courier services. Should they not be able to afford the services, we are more than willing to. We are willing to pay for the services should our budget allow us. Okay, moving on to the operations category, we're having the disasters. So I'll be focusing on flooding, pests, and fire. So now it's flooding in the collections. So the basement gets to be flooded during rainy seasons. So, and this is due to stormwater drains that are not properly cleaned. And during hot wet summers, we're having a record of high humidity, and this leads to formation of molds. And we're also having a washing machine in the basement where the collections are stored. And this event is unlikely. And should we have more of the seasons, it's gonna have a major impact to our departmental plan. And it's looking at the number there, it's a low risk. And the HOD, the facility manager, is responsible for this event. We have dehumidifiers, hygrometers, and thermometers installed in the entomology collection. And we also have a facility manager always checking for the drainage operation. Like, should it not be able to operate properly, it should be cleaned regularly. And as for the machine, we are still looking for an alternative place for it. Next slide, please. Moving on to the next disaster, we're having fire in the collections. So we have alcohol and dry specimens stored in the same basement, and we're also having specimens that are stored in the wooden cupboards. And we have plug points and extension leads on or near the floor in stores that contain alcohol, and these are a hazard. And all plug points are out of date so far, and they are not suitable for the environments where the alcohol fumes are present. And this event is rare, and should it occur, we just gonna have a catastrophic impact, and this will collapse the whole department. And as you can see, the magnitude is maximum, and the facility manager is responsible for this one. So it is a matter of checking with the fire extinguishers that they are regularly serviced, and also the installation of the fire suppression systems, and replacing plug points. And also we are considering always to make sure that the tap materials are always in a fireproof place should we experience fire in some stage. Next slide, please. The next one is fire in our offices. So this would be due to electrical faults. It is a rare situation, and the impact will be minor. It's not really major, and it's a minimum risk. It's not maximum. The staff, the HOD, facility manager, all of them, they are responsible to make sure that we do not have further impact. And it's a matter of always checking with the fire extinguishers, and always making sure that whatever material that we are working with in our offices is not a lot should we have fire in our area, and also making sure that we do not have our holotypes and paratypes in our offices, and we keep them only in the safe. We do not have those in our offices. And moving on to the next disaster, we're having pest infestation in the collection site. So the common pests we have for our museum, we having beetles, we having silverfish, we having butterflies and cockroaches, and they creep in from our side. So they just coming into our building. Yeah, so the cold temperatures, they help in lowering the risk of pest infestation. So in summer, now we are heading towards summer, so the risk is high. And this is unlikely to occur, and it's just gonna cause a major impact on our departmental plan should this occur, and it's of low risk. The HOD and the collection managers are responsible for this event, and we currently have an integrated pest management plan in place, and we also encourage frequent monitoring of collections, especially in summer, because that's where we are experiencing higher risk. And we also looking into fumigating the area as needed, and also cleaning the area, especially towards the basement, removing anything that can attract this pest. Next slide, please. Moving on to the next one. So yes, we're also having pest infestation in our display areas. Yeah, we're still having the beetles, the silverfish, butterflies, the roaches causing all this problem, and it is recorded that the humidity it's higher in the display area than in our collections. So, and unfortunately, we cannot fumigate the cases there because we're having live displays. We're also having scorpions there, so we cannot do that. It's a common event, and it has a moderate impact to our objectives and targets. This is of high risk, and we also have the workshop and design department being responsible to make sure that the display areas are well taken care of. For the mitigation action, we are to ensure that the cupboard guard is replaced regularly. Moving on to the next risk category, we have in the compliance. I'll start off with the permits for sampling. So it is difficult to obtain permits for collecting collecting new specimens. So this leads to less materials being added to our collections, and we usually having the permit authorities being slow on issuing permits. So this is a problem, and it's just a moderate situation, and it has a minor impact to our objectives and achievements in the department. And as you can see there, we're having a rating of 6, so it's a low risk. We're having scientists as well as the conservation authority being responsible for this event. And just to avoid everything, we encourage proper planning, and then the applications should be in advance before going on field trips. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide. Moving on to health and safety compliance challenges. So in the collections, we work with chemicals, and where chemicals are involved, of course, this is a high risk for our health and safety. We have ethanol as well. And also the collections are in the basement, where we need to go down the stairs to go and get the materials. So yeah, sometimes moving materials all the time up and down, it just it can lead to damage to the specimens. And also we're having a situation where we do not have enough office space. So we're having colleagues sharing space, and now we are in the phase of COVID-19, so it's not really doable, but we are trying our best. So this is likely, and the impact is moderate, and it's of medium risk. We're having the HOD, the facility manager, and the Department of Public Works looking into this issue. And for our mitigation action, we have a committee in place for the health and safety. And we are also making sure that our chemicals are well placed in proper containers. Should we be able to use them all the time, we need them in proper containers, so that we do not cause harm to ourselves. And also, when we work, after working with them, we need to dispose them in a proper manner, so that we do not expose them to other people in our environment as well. When it comes to caring of materials, we encourage more help. Should anyone go down the basement, that person should ask for assistance, so that the materials are carried properly and there are no damages. And we have installed screens in the offices where we're having people who are sharing offices. I have an example here. We have one here behind me. Moving on to the next one, we're having policies and protocols. So since we are working with collections now, to protect our collections, we have to have policies and protocols, as well as standard operation procedures, and we are still lacking some of them. So it's a process. This is moderate, and it has a minor impact. With the rating, the magnitude risk, we're having low risk. And this one is for the HOD. The HOD is responsible. So far, the NSCF has compiled a protocol manual for the natural science collections, and in our department, we have started the process of writing and adapting the standard operation procedures and protocols. Moving on to the last part of my presentation, we are having IT-related backups. So at this moment in time, we do not have servers or cloud facilities to back up our data, and it's a moderate situation, and this of the impact is moderate as well, and with the magnitude rating as of low risk. So the collection managers and the HOD are responsible as well for that, for the backups. For the mitigation actions, it is advisable for the staff when you are working with your staff, with your materials, ensure that you back up your own data, and also our computers are installed with servers that should be able to reduce the risk of losing data. The data should have power cuts, and also we're having a register that has been put in place for monthly backups of database. So this is the end of my presentation. I believe that everyone was able to follow with me and have a proper understanding of what we have here in the terrestrial invertebrate department. And I'm so happy to have been given this opportunity, and thank you everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you. I think Michelle will take over from now.
Thanks very much, Jermaine, for that. I think that it's useful to see what a particular department is doing for identifying risks and assessing them, and what mitigation actions they're putting in place. And obviously it's a process. So that's what we've said. It's an ongoing process. And there were some useful comments in the chat that came out during that, some suggestions, and also some comments, like, for example, the courier companies in accepting the loan materials. And that does seem to be a challenge. And I think we should discuss, maybe when we do the access chapter and we discuss about loans and sending material, what are people using, and is there something that we could follow up on and maybe look into? So it is a challenge, not so easily solved. And then Roger also made some comment about the alcohol areas and the electrical fittings in there. So it does need special fittings and light switches outside the rooms. So I think it's also something that is covered in the manual. And then the chemical exposure. And I've just responded there that I think, we will be looking at health and safety in a future webinar. That's a chapter in the manual. And it's actually a legal compliance issue. So we will come back to the staff health and safety as well. So thank you very much for that useful presentation, Jermaine. We really do appreciate it. Okay, so I don't know if there's any other questions for Jermaine now. You can type them in the chat box. Otherwise, there is time at the end as well for more discussion. Okay, nothing seems to be coming through here. All right, so now we're going to look at doing an exercise. As I said, this will help the people with their assignment. It's basically the same as the assignment that we've been given for the 4th webinar. And today we're going to not look at a disaster. So someone made a comment after the webinar, I think, and said, what about other risks? So not disasters. So that's what we're going to focus on today. So not all risks are disasters, as Jermaine showed. You can split them up. So you can have risks that are cumulative. So it creates ongoing deterioration. So pests, wet specimens drying out or losing alcohol. You can have the mold getting onto bones and skins and plant specimens and on your insects. You can have damage from pressure of piling up too many specimens on top of each other. You can have disintegration of labels, so a slow process can take many years, but at the end, you know, at some point, those labels are no longer readable. You can have loss of staff. You can have your database crashing or becoming corrupted. You can have backlogs of unaccessioned specimens, so they build up and they're not really, it's not possible to curate them. And you can have loss of specimens in the collection, so just not being able to find things when you've got a big collection. So all of those are kind of ongoing cumulative risks, not a disaster. And the important thing is to if you want to identify them, is to go back to that illustration, and in the manual, the description of the 10 agents of deterioration. So if you look at the manual, I think it's chapter 5, maybe. It's the collection care chapter, and you'll see what the standards are. So if you're not meeting the standards, then there's often something that could go wrong, and that's a risk. That's our exercise today. It's not about disaster, it's just about cumulative risk. And next slide. Okay, so what we're going to be doing today, we're going to work in groups of 4 or 5, and it's going to be colleagues who work in a similar collection type. And that's why Chanel asked you to label yourself, and she should have put you into groups now. And you're going to have 40 minutes for this exercise. So once you get into your group, you'll be asked to join a group, you'll join it. Decide amongst you who's going to be the scribe to capture the information onto the tables in the presentation. So you should have all received it's a PowerPoint with about 5 slides. So Fulu emailed it to you, but she's also put somewhere else where you can get it. So you'll all have it. What I suggest is that one person screen share so everyone can see. So maybe it's the scribe who does that and can be capturing, and you can see what they're capturing. And then also elect one person as the chair of your group, and that person will make sure that you get through each step on time. You don't get stuck on the first step and not be able to reach the end. So it's that person's job to keep everything moving and to make sure that you get input from all members of the group. So make sure that everybody contributes or has a chance to ask questions, gets involved in the discussion. So that's the process you're going to follow. Try and populate all your slides, and we go to the next slide. So I think this is just this is what you've been sent. So you're first going to identify one risk, just one, and it must be a cumulative risk for your particular type of collection. So if you're working with pests, with a dried insect collection, it could be pest infestation, but one that's a high risk, so something that can have a big impact. Okay, so something that would impact between 1 and 10 years, it would have at least 10% damage on an individual specimen and affect 10% or more of the collection. So just identify one and think about those 10 agents of deterioration. Is it crime? Is it physical force? Is it incorrect temperature, incorrect humidity, light or UV, water, fire, disassociation, which is where you lose the information for it, the collection, pollutants or pests. And so just spend 5 minutes on that. Next slide. Once you've identified your risk, then you look at the options for controlling the risk you identified. So populate this table, thinking about the 5 layers of enclosure, the 4 stages of control. And you're just going to spend 10 minutes on this. So if you can just identify, even if it's 8 options, if you've got more, that's fine, but don't spend more than 10 minutes on this step. So as long as you've got 8 options, that's fine. It's just to get you thinking like this. Right, next slide. And then you list all the options you came up with. So it should be about 8. And then you can estimate how much of the risk would be removed or reduced, what percentage. And then you can just have a wild estimate at the cost. So it doesn't have to be exact, just estimate. And then select from these your 3 best options. So you can highlight them in red. These are the 3 that we would pick to implement. Right, next slide. And then from one of those options, one of the 3, pick one, and then you do an implementation plan for this option. So you spend 10 minutes on this step. What are the steps you would need to take to get that option implemented? Who are the people who would be responsible? Who else would need to be involved? And what sort of time frame would it be? Okay, and then that's it. That's the exercise. Next slide. And then when we come back, we're not going to ask for a full report back. I don't think we're going to have time. But I think we'd like to hear whether there's anything that your group really struggled with. What are the challenges with doing this kind of thing? And then to think about, and if you've got time in your groups, you could also do this, to think about what would be a challenge when you're doing this. Remember, we're doing like one collection, only one risk, only 3 options, and implementing plan for only one of them. So what if you were doing this for the whole institution, for all the collections? You know, what do you think the challenges would be there? And so we'll hear from each group when we come back.